welcome to Let's Text About It, a NAMI Talks podcast hosted by NAMI Maine's Teen Text Support Line team. This podcast highlights the voices of young adults who work on the text line and support youth with mental health challenges. In each episode, we'll delve into the world of peer support, sharing firsthand experiences, insights, and resources to navigate life's challenges. This podcast may address sensitive topics like suicide or self-harm. Please look out for your mental well-being and seek support as needed. The Teen Text Line is open from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. Monday through Friday, and 12 p.m. to 10 p.m. on Saturday and Sunday. The text line can be reached at 207-515-8398 and is meant for people ages 13 to 23 who are looking for mental health support but are not experiencing a mental health crisis. My name is Grace, and today I'm joined by my coworkers Walter and Dennis to discuss teen and young adult men's mental health in honor of June being Men's Mental Health Awareness Month. So, want to give a quick hello, Walter?
Absolutely. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Walter. I've worked at NAMI for about 2.5 years now on the Teen Tech support line, and I'm really excited to be able to sit down with you today and just talk a little bit about growing up as a man in the mental health sphere and what it's been like working on the Teen Tech support line and sort of what I've noticed.
Great. And Dennis?
Yes, hello. I'm Dennis. Really happy to be here as well. I've worked on the text line for maybe a year and a half now. And like Walter, I'm really excited to be here and talk about how it is being a man working in mental health and experiencing mental health.
All right, wonderful. So I'd love to get right in and talk about your personal experience. I'm very curious how mental health was talked about when you were growing up.
I can kick that one off
Okay.
if that's all right with you, Dennis. I think
Yeah,
it was sort of a mixed bag. You know, I was fortunate to have parents and role models who did talk about mental health and who weren't afraid to show their emotions and to normalize it within me. But at the same time, I think, you know, as a boy growing up, it's sort of impossible not to be put into spaces and situations where you're shamed for showing negative emotions, where, you know, you're told to calm down, quiet down, men don't do that, why are you acting like a girl? Stuff like that. You know, it's difficult because even if you have a really supportive family and really supportive environments, I think it's absolutely impossible to get through childhood as a boy or as a man without being shamed for mental health in at least a couple of spheres. I don't know if that's been your experience too, Dennis.
Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of that. I mean, in my personal life growing up, I most people were very supportive from a mental health perspective, and I don't think it was especially stigmatized or anything compared to other people's experiences. But at the same time, as a man, I don't think um, people in my life were as proactive talking about mental health or as conscious of it as if for women, like in the sense that I don't know. I don't think my mental health or any men's mental health was on the forefront of anyone's mind. And it's more like, I'll handle it myself or it'll be all right kind of thing. Whereas maybe it would have been better to have a more open dialogue about that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the thing that, you know, struck me about your answer was that the support was usually there if you went and asked for it, but it felt like, you know, you were always just expected to be doing okay. And it was just sort of the expectation that you handled everything yourself and that you didn't need support if you weren't talking about it. No one really checked in with you. You know, no one really asks you how you're doing. No one really asks if there's anything they can do for you. It's sort of just a situation where it waits until it gets really bad before that support is offered.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, like, for the act of reaching out or asking for help or anything like that, I would say the kind of reaction was either neutral or slightly positive or sometimes negative. So it almost felt like a negative reinforcement situation where if people aren't as enthusiastic to kind of help or hear you out, next time maybe you're not as like open to asking for help.
Yeah, I remember feeling as though I had to pick the people I went to for support really carefully, because it sort of felt like I had to watch their actions and their movements over the course of a couple of months to see, try and guess how they would feel if I opened up to them about how I was really feeling. It definitely felt as though I couldn't just blanket count on people, because that negative
Yeah.
reaction to opening up to someone, it makes it really challenging, like you said, Dennis, to open up to them again. And,
Hmm.
even a neutral reaction is not super motivating. When you're
Yep.
11, 12 years old and you're struggling with things for the first time, and, you go to someone you think is a trusted adult, and it's just, you get sort of the deal with it response. It's not,
Hmm.
it makes it a lot harder the second time around to reach out to someone for help. I definitely think you hit the nail on the head there.
I think
Hmm.
you both raised some really great points. And Dennis, you mentioned the idea of just kind of having to deal with it, which I think is a common kind of misconception. So I'm interested, before we get into like societal stigma and misconceptions, I'm interested in how did that message impact your own connection and openness with your emotions? Do you feel like you only kind of felt a couple emotions, or did you feel like you could feel all of them? Were you closed off to some of them? It's a question for both of you.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think feeling emotions and expressing emotions are two pretty different like skills almost. And
Mm,
of course, that question kind of addresses both of them. In terms of feeling emotions, I'm not sure that I was personally that affected. Like I feel like I feel a pretty normal range of emotions, but in terms of expressing emotions or sharing emotions or my well-being and things like that, I think that that was definitely more affected more directly.
Yeah, I think society sends a message to a lot of young boys that it's okay to be angry, but it's not okay to be anything else. And so I think growing up, a lot of emotions that I was feeling in my day to day life, like shame or embarrassment or frustration, things that would happen at school, things that would happen in my family life, with friends, those would all, I think I would struggle to differentiate those emotions from anger because people responded positively when I was angry, but there was no positive response when I was embarrassed or I regretted something or I was ashamed. People would always ask me if I was mad about it. And it wasn't, there wasn't really that validation for more introspective approaches to emotions. In terms of,
Hmm.
showing those emotions, I agree with you completely. I think it's really hard as a boy growing up to feel as though it's acceptable for you to show a lot of the emotions you might be feeling and might recognize within yourself because, I think if you keep it inside of you, you can always fall back on, well, if it gets really bad, I can share it. But if you share it and the response is negative, all of a sudden that goes away. And now you know how it's going to be if you have to share it in the future.
Hmm.
those are great points. So I guess we're kind of naturally moving into the conversation around societal misconceptions and stigma. And so I'm curious, what kind of messages did you hear and how did those affect your, beyond kind of your family, maybe in media and things like that? How did those messages impact your willingness to discuss emotions and also access mental health resources?
I mean, I think that there's always, the blanket sayings that are quoted a lot now, like, boys don't cry and real men just tough it out and stuff like that. And, I definitely heard that a lot growing up. But I think in terms of how it impacted my ability to assess resources, I think I always just felt as though they weren't for me.
Mm-hmm.
Like those resources existed for other people. It was never something that I could access. It was never something that, I belonged to because I had always been told that it was just something I had to deal with for myself. It's very isolating.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. I would also say I completely agree with that, but also like I feel like all those, like kind of the blanket statement is that men are strong and things like that, which I don't really think there's any harm in being strong, but you kind of lose the nuance there where like, what does being strong mean? Like, does that mean you can never show weakness? Like, I don't think so. So it's almost like when people overgeneralize or oversimplifies these like big picture kind of thoughts, it you lose kind of some of the strength in this situation. So yeah, I honestly, looking back, wish or moving forward, wish that people kind of thought about it more carefully and thought about the nuances and the details of like kind of societal expectations. Because again, I don't think there's anything wrong with men or women being strong, but that doesn't mean that like you can't discuss emotions, for example.
And I think that that gets into a great point about some of the things we talk about on the text line and almost the strength that comes in being an emotional person. I think
Mm.
that emotions can, you can be a very strong person and also be very emotional because moving through those emotions requires strength. So that's a very interesting kind of topic that you mention, and how it can just be viewed differently of like, what is strength, what makes someone a strong person, and the different messages someone can get about that.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, like Dennis was saying, strength means different things to different people. But I think the thing that I've learned, as I've reached my early 20s and as I've gone through college and as I've started working with people who share a lot of the same values around mental health, strength, it comes from relying on community. Strength comes from relying on community and working with a community to lift others up at the same time. I think that, for me, um, being strong no longer means dealing with everything alone. It means having the courage to reach out and talk with others and having the courage to be honest, with my peers and especially with other men in my life to talk honestly about how I'm doing. I think it's a really empowering feeling to check in, with another guy friend, with another man in your life, and for both of you to really express that you're not doing so hot and to just sit down together and talk through what's going on. I think it's a really important link between building those relationships and talking honestly about how you're feeling and how you're doing.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And also, I would say in like emotionally, that's very valuable just day to day, but also in practice, I think that skill can make you more well equipped to kind of handle anything in your life, but including things that are like expected of men. So again, like some expectations of men in society, I can't really think of an example, but not all of them are negative, but kind of like leaning into your emotionality may actually help you like be a more effective man, whatever that may mean, even within like traditional terms. So I think it's kind of an interesting, almost like contradiction within like tradition or within like societal expectations, where like some of these stigmas against men's mental health make it harder to fulfill societal expectations for men.
I think that moves us beautifully to the next question of what are your thoughts and opinions about the tie between healthy masculinity and emotion? And I'm curious, maybe in your opinion, how can young men learn about and understand their emotions, and what was that journey like for you that led you to where you are today?
Dennis, I'll let you hop in on this one first if you want, and then I'll follow it up.
Yeah, sure. Um, this is definitely an interesting question, and it's kind of a complicated one, and I think one that we are not super sure on. But generally speaking, um, I think for anyone, men or women or whoever, um, having a wide range of emotions is very important or necessary. Like everyone always thinks that happiness is the positive emotion and sadness is the negative one, but in reality, you really want a healthy balance of everything in life. And I think a big part of that is communication, and being able to express your emotions, as we talked about earlier. That can be a a challenge for a lot of men, and that can lead to, I think, kind of maybe not ideal or not natural balances of these emotions if you're, like, for example, suppressing sadness or embarrassment or things that you may not feel comfortable talking about. It can kind of throw everything off balance, and then maybe in a month you're less happy, or it's kind of hard to know kind of the repercussions. But in general, I think communication and just expressing your emotions can be a really good way to keep awareness of your emotions.
Yeah, I really like that. I think one of the big things that I sort of have learned in recent years as I've tried to become more in tune with my mental health and more in tune with sort of the other people in my life is that I would take sort of an analytical approach. Something would happen in my life, and I would try to pick out the emotion I was feeling. Like, this makes me feel stressed, or this makes me feel sad, or this makes me feel angry. And I would think that because I had picked out that feeling, I had processed it and I could move on and I could, be fine on the other end of it. And it really wasn't the case. I think probably the biggest thing that I have learned to do that has positively increased my mental health is A, to be honest with the people in my life about how I'm feeling. I think that honesty was a great point. I think it's hard when people ask how you are and you just say you're fine. It's hard to go down either path, but you got to be honest with the people you trust in your life. But the other thing was to actually sit in the emotion I was feeling for a couple hours or a couple minutes or a couple days and sort of give myself the space to feel that emotion and not push myself to move through it immediately. If something happened in my life and I was really sad about it, instead of thinking, hey, I'm sad, I should not be like this, what can I do to improve it? What can I do to make it better? It would just sort of change to, man, I'm sad. This kind of, it sucks. It's hard. And at the same time, it's normal to be sad about what's happened in my life. And, I have people who can support me while I feel sad for a little while instead of just trying to acknowledge that emotion and move on immediately. Take some time to try to really sit in what you're feeling. And then, when it's healthy and when you have that support, you can work to move through it. But don't just identify those emotions and think that because you've identified them, you're not feeling them.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that's really insightful. And I would also add that both recognizing emotions and kind of sitting in those emotions, as you described, are both kind of skills
Mm-hmm.
which may be very difficult for some people. And I think those kind of need to be developed, especially if you don't have a lot of experience or practice or have never tried to recognize and sit in these emotions. It may not be easy, and you may not even be able to do it at all when you first try. Um, but I think, like, working towards them and eventually kind of achieving them is a very valuable exercise.
Yeah, it's absolutely a skill that you have to practice, and it can be kind of frustrating and kind of exhausting. But like any other skill, it's going to get a little bit easier and a little bit better every time you do it, even if it doesn't feel that way in the moment.
Yep.
Great, thank you. And so, moving into kind of challenges that young men may deal with, whether your own or ones that come on the text line, I'm kind of curious. Like, what are the typical issues that young men talk about on the text line, and maybe even among your friend groups?
I think in terms of my life and in terms of what men are struggling with right now, I think there's sort of this struggle for direction and this struggle for identity. I have just recently graduated college and I have a large number of friends, both maybe in their final year and who have been out for a year in sort of that 1 year pre and post college graduation range. And I think that a lot of my friends are just scared of what the future holds. I think society puts a ton of pressure on men to measure their worth as a human being from what they accomplish. And I think it's really hard for men who maybe don't know what they want to do immediately, which is totally normal. The fact that we ask people at 18 years old to figure out what they want to do for the rest of their life, it's just crazy. but there's so much pressure to take your accomplishments as your self-worth that people who are taking a year off or maybe working a job they don't want to stay in forever, they feel less valuable because they're not, quote unquote, doing what they're supposed to do. I think it's just a struggle for identity and a struggle for the next step. I think, Dennis, I don't know if your experience has been similar, but I think as a
No,
man, I've noticed that people sort of expect me to always know what to do next. Whether it's what
mhm.
I'm doing or whether it's what they should do or whether it's, just the next step that anybody should take. I think people always just sort of assume that I've got it all figured out. And, that's hard because of course I don't. Um, and, when I express that to people, they're always a little bit surprised. Like, I thought you had this great plan. I thought, you were doing what you, no, I'm just trying to make my way through life the same as you. And I also don't have it all figured out.
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely agree with all that. And I think, like, kind of as you said, the stronger or more clear that society's expectations are, the kind of harder it is to decide what you want to do. And also, once you pick a path, whether it be permanent or not, the harder it is to kind of be happy with that, or know if that's the right one. Because it's almost like, there's these pressures and you're like, oh, is this my decision? Do I have a choice to change it? Do I even want to? It's kind of just adding layers to what is already a difficult decision. Like, what you want to do in life is obviously a pretty big decision for everyone. Something I've noticed on the text line, um, one interesting aspect about the text line that kind of makes this question a little easier to answer is, a lot of times, because we only start with the phone number, we don't get the like gender of the person we're talking
Mhm.
to.
Yep.
So a lot of times I don't know, and because of that, I would say there are definitely differences in men's and women's issues, but there is also a lot of overlap. And a
Mhm.
lot of the times I find that men and women are generally going through the same things, which is, and of course they're all similar age, so that makes it a little more consistent, like peer relations or family things. Those are all pretty consistent across both men and women.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And it is sort of an interesting perspective to not immediately know who you're talking to. And sometimes it's been surprising, maybe to learn a couple hours into a conversation the identity of the person I'm talking to, because I will have sort of invented a preconceived notion in my mind of what's going on. And when that's shattered, it's sort of a great moment for introspection. I agree with
Yeah.
you completely. I think there's a ton of common threads, um, maybe in this age group specifically, but maybe just in everyone about, maybe struggling to make friends or
Mhm.
struggling with anxiety about the future or anxiety about meaning in life. I think that's, Grace, you and I both have had people recently that have just talked about struggling to find a point
Mhm.
to life and this sort of uh, big top down approach to trying to figure out, what is the meaning in anything they're doing. I think I wish that more young boys and more young men knew that if they're struggling with something, chances are that a lot of other people
Mm.
are too. And it's not some failing on their part to have a struggle, and it's not some failing on their part to be challenged by something. It's something that everybody is going through, and it's totally normal. It's an incredibly transformative age, but even through life, um, struggle is part of the human experience.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And an interesting thing about what you just said, like, in the same way that let's say a young boy is keeping their internal struggles to themselves, the young men around them keeping their internal struggles to themselves makes it seem like no one else is struggling, when in reality everyone is, but everyone's just keeping it to themselves. So it's almost just like a cycle where everyone feels the like obligation to just keep everything to themselves, because they don't want to be the only one to share that they're not doing all right.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pretty vicious cycle at times.
Mhm.
And I think nothing makes me happier them learning from someone on the text line that they've opened up to a friend group and they're finding a lot of support there. You know, maybe there was something that they were afraid to tell them, or there was something that they were afraid to talk about because they didn't want to be seen as weak, or they didn't want to be, you know, seen as not being able to handle whatever's going on. And then they text back and they say, hey, you know, I shared this with my best friend, or I shared this with my teacher, or I shared this with my coach. And it's always so wonderful to hear how much support they found in that community and how much more willing now people are to talk with them about their struggles and their mental health too, once they learn that there's sort of a safe place in that friend group.
Hmm. Yeah.
The themes of isolation and community are coming up a lot, and I want to make sure we get back to that. But I'd like to deviate from our questions just for a moment, because as you were both speaking about expectations, and Walter, you said the word like what you're supposed to be doing, it made me kind of think about what you both are doing right now. Um, Dennis, you're still in college. Walter, you just graduated, and I know that you have your own kind of separate career plans. But right now, you're both working for a mental health text line, or you're both working in the mental health world. Whether you continue to do that or not, you know, to be determined. And that's totally cool. But stereotypically, I think a lot of people would agree with me that the mental health world is pretty female dominated. And so I'm really curious about what have your experiences been like? What were the reactions from your friends and loved ones when you said this is something that you wanted to pursue? And kind of just how has that gone? I'm going to leave that kind of open ended because I think I'll rattle off too many questions, then I'll forget what I asked. So, yeah, entering kind of a female dominated field, what has that been like for you?
I think, you know, at the very baseline, I've always been one of no more than two men in the room. You know, Dennis, for a long time, I was the only male identifying person working on the text line, and I didn't really interact with any other men in this field. You know,
Mm,
it was a very strange feeling to work for an organization of, you know, 30 to 40 people, and there maybe being three men, including you, in that
Mm.
organization. And so I think for anybody breaking into a field where a lot of the people maybe don't look like them, it can be
mm,
kind of intimidating.
mm,
I found a lot of support here at NAMI Maine in terms of, you know, the perspective that I can bring to these issues and stuff like that. And I think in my personal life, the reaction has been really positive as well. But I think, especially when I was starting out, a lot of people were confused
mm,
about why I wanted to do this. You know, it doesn't really align with my end goal career. But at the same time, I think a lot of people assume that, you know, for men who want to go into this mental health role, uh, you have to have like some pivotal mental health challenge that, you
mm.
know, it reshapes your perspective. And, you know, because you struggled so greatly or you had such a phenomenal loss in your life, all of a sudden you want to learn to do this. It really wasn't true for me. You know, I know that most people who work at NAMI, and especially most people who work on the text line, have had some lived experiences with mental health, and I'm certainly no stranger to that. But I think people assume that if a man is working in mental health, it must be because something has happened to him. And I just don't think it's the truth. You know, I saw how little support there was out there for men and how little support there was out there for youth and how much people wish they just had someone that they could talk to. And that was really what inspired me to join the teen text line at NAMI. I don't know if your experience has been the same, Dennis.
No, I definitely agree. Winding the clock back to my freshman year when was kind of figuring out my major, and I was leaning towards psychology as my major. And I didn't really realize that psychology, both the major and just generally the field, is kind of very heavily female dominated. So my first psych elective class, I go into the room and it's like me and one other man and like 30 women. So that was that was when I realized. But when I started talking to everyone, and then later I met more men with psych majors, I realized that the men there were just like me. They weren't like psych geniuses. They weren't like therapists already their freshman year. they were just men like me who are interested in mental health and learning about it and maybe working in it one day. And yeah, from that realization, I kind of made the conclusion that it doesn't, like, it is a little daunting to be in the minority in this case, but that doesn't mean that there aren't people like me, and that doesn't mean that it isn't like a valid path to take.
And so I'm going to kind of connect what you're saying back to that vicious cycle that we talked about. It's almost like if you grow up as a young boy, a young man, out of touch with your emotion, feeling like you can't talk about it, then you're probably not going to pursue a career in fields where emotions are talked about a lot, like maybe like the mental health field. And so then there's a huge lack of representation for young men, and when it comes to mental health providers, and that's representation. If we're talking about like cisgender white men, and then getting into representation with more diverse identities, it's even less and less and less. And so I guess it perpetuates that circle. And so I've always felt on the text line that having both of you is just absolutely invaluable to for representation. And because we do have people that reach out and are like, can I talk to a guy? And I mean, we can't, sadly we cannot meet your exact request because
Not all the time,
no,
anyway.
no, because people work when they work. But that representation is so important, and it's so important just beyond the conversation that we're having. But as you guys are talking, I can see that cycle of falling into gender roles, and then how that may lead men astray from mental health services in the mental health field, which then further isolates the next generation of young men when it comes to getting help. And so, I mean, this again, a great segue into talking about for men, young men who are scared of opening up about their mental health challenges, whether that be to friends, family, the text line, getting support from a therapist. What would you tell them, and kind of what was your process like in opening up?
That's a tough one because I feel like everybody's circumstances are different. And, again, I was pretty lucky growing up to have a lot of positive male role models. Positive in the sense that they weren't afraid to talk about their emotions and they weren't afraid to show healthy emotions. And I always struggle a little bit with young men on the text line who really want to open up to a friend, but they're afraid of judgment, or they really want to open up to a parent because they're afraid of judgment. Because I know deep down that, as sad and discouraging as it is sometimes, I can encourage them all they want, but I don't know that other person. And if they do open up to that person and they get a bad response, that can be so hurtful. And so
Mm.
I think what I would tell them is that somebody cares. Whether it's us on the text line, I can guarantee you that we care. But, your friends do care, and you do have family that cares, and you do have teachers that care. And so I think, you know, keep trying to open up. I can't guarantee that the first response you get is positive. I wish I could, but as a young man struggling with mental health, I can't guarantee that you're going to have a good first experience opening up to someone, which is so hard because I think that initial opening up is so important. Um, but I think even if you don't get a good response the first time, keep trying and try again, because the moment you find that person that does sit down with you and see you as an individual with feelings and sadness and emotions and, all that complicated thing that makes us human, it's going to feel incredible to find that person. So whether it's reaching out to a mental health resource who I can almost guarantee you is going to give you a good positive response, to finding that friend that really cares, finding that supportive adult. Don't give up. Keep trying to reach out. Keep trying to make those connections.
Mm. Yeah, I definitely agree with all that. And I would also say, like, the first step a lot of times is going to be the hardest. So I would recommend, obviously, it's hard to tell sometimes, but trying to find whoever you're most comfortable with. So, for example, if you're really scared to tell your parents, you can start by telling a friend or your sibling or your guidance counselor or teacher, whoever you feel like the conversation will be easier with. And you can kind of work up to that kind of end goal where by the time you are eventually talking to your parents, you've already talked to three people. Not only are you more comfortable with it, you've already gotten hopefully some positive responses and a little bit of a support network. So by that time, you're a little bit more prepared and have this reinforcement to have this probably a little bit difficult, but hopefully very important conversation. So yeah, I would definitely say work up to it and like take a second to be like, what I'm doing is difficult, but it'll be worth it, and just go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Come tell us. Come work up to it with us. If for some reason you're a young man or woman or whatever you identify as, and you're listening to this podcast, this is a safe place for you. And if you're scared about telling someone in your life, if you have something that you've been keeping to yourself and you want to get it off your chest, come talk to us. I can't tell you the number of people that have texted in and that we have talked to and helped them come up with a strategy and, role play what they want to say and, brainstorm what to write in that letter and talk about their fears and talk about some strategies. I mean, we're not a crisis line, but that makes us capable of really talking about anything. If you are struggling with something, anything in your day to day life, the Teen Text Line is a safe place for you. And, we can sit down with you. We're just normal people. We can come up with some sort of game plan. We'll brainstorm it with you. We'll treat you like you were anyone else in our life, and we'll try to figure out how we can best support you while you make these difficult steps. It is hard. It's going to be difficult, but like you said, Dennis, that first step is the most important. Work up to it, and don't get discouraged.
Yeah, and also something I would quickly add, you mentioned like talking about fears or like ideas of what may happen. I think a lot of people, when thinking about these difficult but also very unknown or new experiences or conversations, have this like nebulous kind of worry or anxiety or fear, which is natural because it's very hard to think specifically like really what could go wrong, what could they say. But once you start thinking about what could actually happen, the kind of fear becomes less nebulous, and it you realize that it, like once you think about all the possibilities, it's maybe not as bad as you thought before you thought about specifics. So I think just thinking about what may happen is actually a really helpful exercise as well.
That's great. So, something I want to talk about now, and I know, Dennis, I think that you touched on this a couple podcast episodes ago, but I open the question to both of you, of course. In taking this job on the text line and in kind of having a journey with your own mental health, how has that impacted your social relationships with other men? Do your male friends seem more comfortable coming to you with challenges? Are you kind of like the spokesperson in your friend group for mental health, or kind of what does that look like, and how has that changed since you've taken this job and just explored mental health and been more open about it in general?
I can let you kick this one off, Dennis, if you want.
Yeah, sure. Well, I would say, I mean, within my friend group, I think people, because I tell them about my work on the text line, people sort of have an idea of me as a somewhat of a mental health advocate. Not that everyone's coming to me with all their problems, but yeah, I think generally, I hope that my friends are just with my presence more comfortable talking to me about whatever may be going on, but also talking to each other and just realizing that like even me just saying that I work on the text line um, kind of lets people know that I'm not going to stigmatize their mental health or
Mm.
give a negative response to whatever they may be saying. So just recognizing that I think is a big step. And that's not even like me working on the text line is not even really necessary for that step to be taken. It's almost just like me saying I have positive ideas about mental health and I'm good to hear you out on whatever you want to say. So yeah, I think generally my friend group is pretty like relatively open about that kind of thing.
Yeah, I would agree completely. It's interesting because as I think back about it, most of my friends have generally been uh, women, but especially now, I feel like I've cultivated this small group of really close male friends. There's about four of us. And we've been through a lot together. And I agree with you completely. I don't know that it's my work on the text line so much as it's just the fact that, by example, there's not a lot about me that I'm afraid to talk about. And there's
Mm.
not a lot about me that I don't ask people to listen to. And, if one of my homies says, uh, you can talk to me about something, I'm going to take him up on it and I'm going to talk to him about it. Whether it's
Mhm.
me drawing support from him or him drawing support from me, I think follow through is really important. And I think you did a great job of touching on it, Dennis. It's for guys out there who want to support your friendship. They want to support your friends, whether you be male or otherwise. If you say that you're a safe place and you're passionate about mental health, be prepared for people to open up to you because there's not a lot of places for them to go always. And I think within my friend group, regardless of gender, I think I'm really fortunate that my friends have come to think of me as a safe place, uh, by and large, for talking about life struggles, talking about mental health, talking about trauma, anything like that. And it's really wonderful to be able to be that person for others, provided that you're taking care of yourself and providing that you're not burning the candle at both ends, trying to be there for everybody. Let them be there for you too. I think that was something that, as I got into mental health more, I think there was almost sort of a dangerous uh, door that I almost opened, which was, now that I'm trained in this, I can be it for everybody. And, I can be strong for everybody and I can always be the shoulder to cry on. And I always know what to say. And it's sort of almost falling into that pit of toxic masculinity again, of having to be this pillar for everybody else around. And because you're helping everybody else process their emotions, you shouldn't show weakness and you shouldn't process yours, which of course is ridiculous. And I'm glad I didn't fall down that trap of feeling as though I had to now be there for everybody and go at it alone myself. The community I built here has been really good, even if I am reluctant or even if I pull away. They can tell that something's going on and they'll corner me until I open up in a good way. And it's really important to build those connections that go both ways. It can't be you doing everything for everybody. Let them do it for you as well. Let them be a resource for you.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I would also expand that to it not only relating to mental health, but any field that can be emotionally draining or taxing. I think you work as a first responder, right? And so do I. Like my school EMT service they work in conjunction with the school to provide, like after a really difficult call, you can have a free counseling session to talk through it, things like that. Like any job or piece of knowledge that you're sharing with people or service that you're providing that may kind of be making you exhausted emotionally or taking some kind of toll, you should really be taking the steps like we talked about in the staff meetings, like self-care, to take care of yourself so you can continue to provide that service for others. I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Dennis, I had forgotten that you and I have both done a lot of work in the first responder and emergency medical field. Um, and, it's so great to hear that your service has that program where people who are feeling really burnt out, maybe struggling with a specific incident or just stress as a whole, can go find some support. The services I've worked for have taken a really similar approach. I think it also gets into a little bit of job related stress and exhaustion. Um, I'll
Mhm.
generalize a little bit here, but I think that a lot of men working in these mentally exhausting fields don't really realize just how easy it is to get burnt out. And I think maybe they don't recognize within themselves what burnout is. And a lot of people just think it's normal to not really do anything outside of work, to not have hobbies, to not really have relationships. And especially if you're working in a more taxing or exhausting field, or one that just eats up a lot of your time, work to just build those connections outside of work as well. It's easy for men to fall into the trap of being defined by your job. Society does a lot of that for you. You are what you do is a phrase that I have heard a lot working in these male-dominated emergency response fields. And I think a lot of men struggle with making their work their identity. And there's nothing wrong with being proud of your work and, deriving a lot of who you are from it, but just make sure that it doesn't consume you.
Yep.
So this again, I'm going to go off script a little bit.
It's okay. That's all I've been doing.
Thank you. So I appreciate that. So I mean, this brings up just such an interesting conversation of you both have your hands in two different pools. One is in the mental health field, which tends to be more female dominated, and then the other is in the emergency services is EMTs, which, as you mentioned, tends to be more male dominated. And so I'm curious, obviously, protecting confidentiality and things like that, but how have you found your work on the text line, and just your openness about mental health? How's that been received by the other EMTs that you work with, if it is relevant at all?
Yeah. To be honest, it's been fantastic, at
Mm.
least for me. I actually got into the mental health field and started working in this field in part because I saw how much the youth that I would serve in an emergency medical capacity were maybe struggling with mental health
Mm-hmm.
and felt as though there weren't resources for them to turn to. It's been really great to know that you have the skills to handle people who are really struggling and to give them compassionate care. Um, I think that a lot of coworkers can maybe be initially confused about it at first, about why you're doing it, and maybe don't understand what's going on. But once they see how those skills can benefit all areas of your life, be it personal, professional, internal, I think it's sort of a light bulb goes off in their head a lot of the time, and they sort of make the connection that being able to comfortably talk about it, being able to identify those feelings and those struggles can be really helpful outside of any specific field. I'd also point out that there's usually mental health roles and responsibilities no matter what job you do. It's something that I do for the military. It's something that I do for the emergency medical services that I work for. It there's always opportunities to be there for others. You just sort of have to seek them out.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. And I think you make a really good point of saying that most jobs, especially kind of service related ones, have a mental health aspect. And I think EMT is a great example of that. Even if an EMT call, isn't classified as a mental health call, for example, like a panic attack, there's always going to be a mental health aspect. For example, if somebody like breaks their arm, like, yes, that's a physical ailment, but of course there's a mental health aspect to that. Like, that's a really tough situation. Like, not only does it hurt, but the implications of not being able to use your arm for a month or two, that is really tough. And just keeping that in mind as you're providing service for this person, and kind of like with that in mind, trying to lighten the load from a mental health perspective, can make the difference between a really tough situation for them and a slightly better situation for them. So I think that can be really important to keep in mind. And I think as any EMT, whether you're working on the teen text line or not, learns to realize that. And it's something that's generalizable to a lot of different professions. So I think it's really important.
Yeah, emotional intelligence is huge. It's really big. Compassion for others and just the ability to really emphasize. I think you made a really great point, Dennis, about every situation having a mental health aspect. Be it in that job, be it in a different job. it could be in landscaping, and the jobs you're doing and your coworkers will be thinking about something, and there will be a mental health aspect to their day-to-day life.
Mhm.
Just being able to identify with that and be an empathetic voice and ear, it just does so much. It's not super hard, but just learning to understand other people's struggles and fears. Um,
Mhm.
it opens so many doors to making other people's lives better and making your own life better. It doesn't take a lot to be that person for someone.
Definitely.
Great. I appreciate you sharing your experience, both as EMTs, and dare I say, you appear to be breaking that vicious isolation cycle,
Woo.
and bringing the, as you mentioned, emotional intelligence and mental health knowledge you have into that more male dominated, like, you're hurt, let's fix it, field, instead of, and you're taking it in like, you're hurt, let's talk about it, and that's part of fixing it.
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
think that it's evident that you are able to use skills, from what you've learned on the text line in the mental health field, and translate them, to that job as an EMT. So that's really wonderful. So I would love to wrap us up with a couple final questions. What are some resources out there for men? And maybe what are some resources that you looked for when you were trying to get more involved in mental health or take care of your own mental health?
I can start us off. I think the most kind of I don't want to say obvious, but the most natural one is things in real life, like personal connections, and that is a very valuable resource, and something I of course rely on. But sometimes it can be hard to find those, and in those times you may want to look for other resources. But I would encourage people to really look for personal connections, even if you can't find a friend or a family member, even like a teacher or a guidance counselor. I know I talked about it earlier, but just taking a 5-minute conversation with them can be more helpful than you think. So I think that's a really important resource. But of course, there's resources, for example, online, like the text line, that can not only help you in the moment, but help you take steps to find those resources.
Absolutely. I'm just going to echo what Dennis said because he kind of said it all. Coaches, teachers, people at your school, people in your day to day life. It's going to be more helpful than you think to open up to them and to just start having that conversation. Friends, definitely. Anyone in your life that you feel really close to and that you've been through a lot with is probably going to be more likely than not to be there for you 100%. Outside of those, the teen text line is a really great resource. Come talk to us. We're young people. We'll help you figure it out, or at least we'll do our best. We don't always have all the solutions, but we'll at least be empathetic and a safe place for you to think about it. Um, in terms of crisis situations, uh, all of the crisis resources that I have had the pleasure of working with have been really supportive to men that I have referred over there. I've used some of them myself. Don't be afraid to reach out in those really dark moments. Please reach out to somebody. There are people there to help you. Just the hardest step is that initial conversation. That is what takes the most effort. And once you do that, it does get easier.
Great. And so that brings us to our final question, which again goes back to conversation. So I think, kind of as we've been talking, or as you guys have been talking, it's been kind of to the young people that maybe are reaching out to us, or to the young people that may be listening. And so I'm interested on the flip side if we have any, adult caregivers or teachers or anyone, or doctors, nurses, anyone listening who cares for or cares about young men. How do you think someone could start a conversation about emotions and mental health with their child or patient or client or student?
I would say the biggest thing, and it might seem really obvious, but you'd be shocked at how many people don't just validate their emotions. If a young man in your life is talking to you about feeling stressed, feeling angry, feeling sad, feeling heartbroken, hopeless, anything like that, don't immediately jump into solutions. Take a minute to sit with them and acknowledge that what they're going through must be really difficult, and normalize it for them. Let them know that it's okay to feel those emotions, and it's okay to look more deeply into your emotions beyond the initial response. Um, Talk about your own mental health with them, normalize it. Share something about yourself. It's going to make it a whole lot easier for them to share something with you. Um, I think it's a twofold question. I think they need to know that you're a safe place for them, and at the same time, um, they maybe will need you to acknowledge what's going on first. It says a lot to have somebody show care for you without asking for it.
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely agree with all that. I would also say for those looking out for young men, and kind of looking for signs or like indicators of how they may be doing, I think how young men and women express how they're doing is quite different. And I think for young women, they often take a more direct approach from what I've seen. They're more say exactly how they're feeling, or they say, "Hey, I'm not doing okay." And that's because I think it's a lot of times more positively enforced than when men try to do that. So a
Agreed.
lot of times men will be a little bit more vague or a little bit indirect. And in those times, it will never hurt to ask, even if you get it wrong and it's absolutely nothing and they're completely fine. It's never bad to ask, what did you mean by that? Like, are you doing all right? Kind of thing. I think that can go a long way. Again, even if they're doing fine, even just asking that, I think can be really helpful and also open up a conversation down the line where they realize this person cares about me. And even if you don't pick up on it down the line, they may feel more comfortable to bring it up with you.
That's a great point, Dennis. I think, even now, a lot of my friends, and I find myself doing it too, if someone asks how I am, I'm fine. I'm dealing
Mm.
with it. It is what it is. I'm working through it. If somebody
Mhm.
asks again, are you actually fine? Are you, what's going on? Talk to me about what's going on. Just following up that initial ask is huge. It
Mm.
helps me understand that you actually care about how I'm doing, and it's not just a formality. You're not just asking because you feel you have to. If you ask, how are you doing? How are you actually doing? The follow up is big.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a big difference between like, hey, how's it going? And like how are you actually doing? Like if you ask it more deliberately, I think it opens up a more like open conversation. I think it's a
Absolutely.
great point.
Light bulb goes off.
Great. And I also think that, um, I think this goes for all hard conversations, but it's okay for it to be a bit awkward. I think that is a big thing. Like I think like it is okay to feel uncomfortable. It's okay to feel awkward, and it's okay to feel small in that conversation too. I think that opening yourself up to vulnerability can be really difficult, and it can make you feel like you kind of want to like just shrink into a corner, um, and trying to let yourself feel that and see how that is received by the other person. And hopefully it will be received well. So that's the end of the questions for us today. But is there anything that you guys would like to add before we close out?
I think I would just add that it's changing. you know, Even if you've had bad experiences in the past, even if you felt as though there was no one you could talk to, it is changing. And I can tell you that firsthand, that every day more and more people are acknowledging the things that men in their life are struggling with. Every day, men are finding support systems. Every day, friend groups are becoming places for conversations about mental health. And if yours isn't, if you feel like you can't talk to your friends, if you feel like you don't have a place to turn to, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is to be that first person to open up and to make it easier for everybody else.
Mhm. I definitely agree with that. And it almost, I would say it spreads and it's something that people want to spread, especially men, but it's difficult to be the first person. So I think someone may find that if you're that first person, 10 people may do the same the next day. So it's okay to take that first step.
I agree. Being vulnerable is so hard, but it takes so much strength to do it.
All right. Thank you both so much. So that's all for this episode of Let's Text About It. Make sure to subscribe to NAMI Talks wherever you get your podcasts. And if you liked this episode, make sure to like and share. Thank you for listening, and we hope you tune in to the next episode. Bye-bye.